You're watching Inside the Sony NX Camcorder Training DVD brought to you by VAST. Hi, my name's Douglas Spotted Eagle, and for the next little while we're going to be together going through all of the different buttons and switches and levers and the menu features and some of the different things that you can set up inside of this camcorder. We're going to be talking about some of the challenges of working with AVC HD formats and some of the great things that you can do with this format. We're going to dive into picture profiles and how to best use this camera to make the greatest video you can possibly make. You ready? Let's dive in. Let's take a tour around the entire camcorder. Right now is a good time to hit pause, grab your NX cam, and hold it in your hands and do the tour with me. Even if you're pretty familiar with the camera, you might find a feature or two that you've missed as you've handled it before. So we're going to start at the front end of the camcorder. Let's move to the front. We've got a lens hood here, and this lens hood can be removed. All we need to do is go to the upper right hand side and there's a small button. Press the small button and rotate, and it pulls off the lens hood. Now, one thing to be aware of in the lens hood is not only does it have this opening and closing device that you can see here that lets us open and close the lens hood, but this device is just a little fragile. Be sure that you don't get any mud or dirt inside the hood itself. If you do, you need to take this apart and clean it out. It's kind of a delicate process to do. You can find instructions on how to do this on the VAST website. Let's put this back on the front. You'll notice that the camcorder has Sony's new G lens series on it. This lens has been designed and optimized to specifically work with the type and size of sensor that are found inside the NX cam, and it's set up like any other broadcast lens. The front ring is the focus ring, the second ring back is the zoom ring, and the final ring to the rear is the aperture or the iris ring. And it's set up so that as we zoom the camera in on the middle ring, moving it to the right, zooms it out, moving it to the left, zooms it in. And with the iris ring, it's set up like all other camcorders. As we rotate it to the right, it closes down the aperture. As we rotate it to the left, it opens up the aperture. All right, let's move back a little farther, and we've got a couple of blocks here. We're going to go through these blocks segment by segment. So let's start at the top of the central block. The first thing you'll notice is there are 3 buttons up here, and they're all labeled. One of them is assigned to be the zebra indicator, next is the auto exposure shift, and then finally is our index visibility or index view. These 3 buttons are all assignable. We can change them to be whatever we want. So the labels that are printed on the camera don't necessarily mean that that's what functions these buttons have to do. Okay, moving down. From here we've got our neutral density filter, and we have 3 different neutral density settings, 4 if you count the neutral density setting of none. Now this is an actual optical neutral density filter, so in other words, the camera is placing a piece of glass inside the lens in front of the viewfinder or the optical imager in the camera. So moving on back from there, we have a focus switch. Now this focus switch allows us a couple of different options. First of all, we can put it in a fully auto focus position all the time, or the way that I like to run it, we can put it in a manual focus mode, and what that allows us to do is we can use the manual focus via the focusing ring, or we can just simply press down on that button and automatically go into an autofocus mode or a temporary autofocus mode. We can do the same thing with this small button that's found right below that autofocus mode button as well. So we've got a couple of different options. I tend to generally run this camera in a manual focus mode as opposed to autofocus. I find that I feel more comfortable and a little bit more secure that way, but the autofocus does work pretty well on the camcorder. Okay, moving straight down from there. You'll see that we've got some buttons here off to the side. The first button we see here is a gain button. This allows us to turn on and off the automatic or manual functions of the gain process in the camcorder. In other words, the camera can set its own gains and it can work with itself automatically, or we can put it into a manual gain mode. In manual gain mode, we can determine what the gain is going to be by using the small gain switch that's found directly underneath the gain on-off button. Coming straight back from there is our white balance button. This button allows us to set the white balance on the camcorder manually. Now the camcorder has got 5 different white balance modes, and we'll be looking at those as we get into the menus, but it's easy to know that the camera can have an auto white balance mode, it can have a preset white balance mode, and we can set that in the internal menu system to be indoor, outdoor with a couple of shifts, or we can set a couple of manual white balance modes. So we have several different options for setting white balance, but if we choose a manual white balance, we're going to do it with this button. Now this button's pretty easy to find because the button has a small raised knob on it, so that if we're looking for it, we can just rub our fingers across and you'll feel that small raised knob. That'll let you know that you've got your finger on the white balance button. Moving straight back from there, we have a shutter speed button. When we engage the shutter speed button, we'll see in the display that the shutter speed indicator lights up, and we'll be able to change that shutter speed. And we do that by hitting the rotary selector switch that's on the side of the camcorder. We'll come to that in just a moment. But you can leave this set to a manual or an auto position. Okay, coming straight down from there, you'll notice that at the front of the bottom block we have an iris button, and this also has got a little raised knob in the center of the button. This lets us know that we're on that iris button. What that allows us to do is instantly set the iris to an automatic format, or set the aperture of the camera to be at an automatic mode. It's a temporary thing. If we press this, it doesn't put it into auto mode full time. All it does is adjust the exposure for that particular moment. So if you're not sure what your exposure should be, just simply click this button and that'll put you in the correct exposure mode, regardless of where you set the ring. In fact, you might want to try that. Just go ahead and close down or open your iris ring up on a shot, and then press the iris button, and you'll see that it changes the iris in the shot. Moving straight back from there, we've got a gain switch that's got 3 different positions. It's got a low, medium, and a high position. And I like setting these up so that it's -3 in the low position, 6 dB in the medium position, and 9 dB in the high position. Your mileage may vary, but I like keeping my gain fairly reduced. This camera does have what's called a hyper gain mode, but that's not accessible through this particular switch unless we set it up that way in our button assignments. We can assign hyper gain to one of the other buttons here. We'll talk about what that is a little bit later on. Okay, coming straight back from there, we have our white balance switch. And this white balance switch here allows us to choose which of the 3 white balances we've got assigned to the button. So we can go to our preset mode here. At the very bottom, we can go to white balance A and white balance B just by flipping the bat handle up and down. And this lets us access the different white balances we've set up. For instance, you might set a white balance for an indoor shot and a white balance for an outdoor shot. Maybe you're starting a wedding inside of a church and then going out onto the street afterwards where you'll be in sunlight. You can set this up to work that way. You can also use auto white balancing if you feel that the camera does this appropriately for you. One of the reasons it's great that you can set white balances manually with the camcorder is because you might want to shoot to a cooler card or a warmer card to warm up or cool down a shot. It's pretty easy to do. You can find a lot of information about shooting to warm type cards out on the web. Coming straight back from there, we have our white balance set button. And the way that we'll use this is simply by pointing the camcorder at a white object, pressing this button, and it will automatically white balance the shot for us based on what it sees in the scene. Now you don't have to fill up the whole lens with white, but it's a good idea to have as much white in the front of the lens as you can possibly have. The important thing is making sure that the white that you're shooting is in the lighted area that you're shooting. It doesn't do you very much good to simply put a white balance card or a white card or a white t-shirt out in front of the camcorder if it's in a different lighting situation in which you'll be shooting. Okay. Coming back to the next block, right here we're going to find our audio tools. First of all, you'll notice up in the top is the GPS indicator. This is just the housing for that area. Coming straight down from there, we have our audio section, so we can open up this door and have a look at the audio section. The first thing that you'll notice is we've got switches here. And the switches allow us to control the internal-external mic input. And then next to that is an auto or a manual level set. Now if we put this in the auto level set, the camcorder is going to automatically set levels for us. I'm not a big fan of that, but it might be something that you like. Auto levels mean that the camera is making a lot of decisions for us, and I tend to really want to choose what my camera is hearing. I might have ideas about what the dynamics of the performance are going to be, and the camera is not able to anticipate those kinds of changes. Another reason that I don't like the auto system is because it automatically will gain things up or down depending on background noise, etc., and I want to make those decisions myself. While we're here in this particular section, I want to make sure that I recommend you always wear headphones whenever you're using this camcorder. It's not really good practice to turn on your camcorder and record audio without listening to what's going into the camcorder, just like you wouldn't turn on the camcorder and film something without looking through the external viewfinder or through the eyepiece of the camcorder. So it's a good idea to always be monitoring through headphones, and this has got a lot of headphone control. We'll look at those headphone controls a little bit later on in this DVD. And coming straight down from there, we've got an auto and a manual switch. This allows us to control whether the camera is in a fully auto mode or a fully manual mode. And when fully manual mode, we can make some decisions as to what those modes are going to do. We can decide that it's in a partial manual mode and partial auto mode, or we can determine that it's in a fully manual mode, fully auto mode. I'm not a big fan of fully auto modes, but there's one place where it's particularly useful. If you're in a situation where you need to flip the camera on, get the shot, and have it be the best it can be under speedy circumstances, put the camcorder in fully auto mode. And that means that the camcorder will get the very best picture it can based around what it can see. Now in the menus, you'll see that we've got some options to limit what those auto modes can do. And I recommend that you'll set some of those things up to get the very best picture possible. But we'll dive into that when we get into the menu sections on this training DVD. All right. Coming straight down from the auto manual switch, we've got the selector switch. Now this is where we're going to be navigating through the menu. This is a rotary dial switch, and you'll notice that there's a side-to-side arrow right next to that. That allows us to navigate through the menu a little more quickly. The NXCAM has got more features for navigating the menu than any other Sony camcorder in the past has had. And in fact, if you use the remote control and get into the modes and then the menu modes, you'll find that you can navigate through the camcorder using the remote as well. So it's got a number of different ways of getting through the menus, but this rotary knob is the way that Sony has designed it to predominantly navigate the menus. Now this knob is kind of sensitive, so as you're flipping through, use a light touch. It's easy to accidentally execute something if you've got a heavy hand. I do, and there have been a couple of times I've accidentally set something that I didn't mean to, and you need to go back and change that. But this rotary switch is where we're going to navigate through all the different menus. Okay, moving straight back from there is our menu button. And this menu button is what puts the camera into menu modes. The camera has a couple of different methods or ways to access that menu button, but this is the primary way to get into the camera menus is through this menu switch or menu button that we find right here. There's also one on the top of the camcorder, there's one on the remote control, and there's one through the touch screen. So there are 4 different ways that we can get into the various menu selections in this camcorder. Okay, coming straight back from there, we have the modes button. Now this is something that's new in the Sony camera lineup. When we click on the modes button, it puts the camera into a variety of different mode choices, and these are accessed via the touch screen in the LCD panel. So when you press that button, you'll note that it comes up with camera modes, play modes, edit modes, the memory modes, and managing media modes, and then a menu button. And these allow us to get through the different menu modes or the different menu settings for the camera and editing and so forth. So we'll turn that back off so that we're not in the modes. Moving straight back from there is our picture profile button. Picture profiles are something that we can set up inside this camcorder to have this camera look the way we'd like it to look. And this is one of my favorite features about all of the different Sony camcorders and pretty well all of the new modern camcorders is that we can set up specific looks. We might have a look set up for shooting mostly desaturated, or for shooting black and white shots, or for crushing down blacks and extending dynamic range. There might be a few different things we want to do, and we can set this camera up to work and look the way we'd like it to work and look. Coming straight back from picture profiles, we're going to have the status check button. And in my mind, this is one of the most important features in this and any other camcorder is status check. By turning on status check, it lets us see the modes and the settings that are in the camera right now. So if you're picking the camera up after someone else has used it, or after it's been a while since you've used it, or maybe you've been shooting some different kinds of things, hit the status check button, and that'll let you know where your audio levels are at. It'll let you know whether you've used a picture profile, or what your shutter speed, battery life, how much time is remaining on your flash cards, and a number of other things in the camcorder. It's just the quickest way to get into the guts of the camcorder and see exactly what's going on. So at the rear of the camcorder, we're going to find a very few things, but they're pretty important. We're going to start by lifting up the eyepiece. And in the eyepiece, you'll notice that there's a focus adjustment indicator. Now, this focus adjustment that we find on the bottom of the eyepiece does not affect what's being recorded into the camera. It just simply adjusts the focus for the eyepiece itself. So if you wear eyeglasses, or maybe you don't want to wear eyeglasses and you need to be able to look through the viewfinder, you can set the focus up for you as an individual. There's a couple of ways that you can set this up, but the best way, I think, to set this up is to close down the viewfinder on the lens, or close down the hood so that all we're seeing is black, and then turn on the menus. And while the menus are up, you can see the letters. You just simply adjust this focus control until the menus are in perfect focus. That'll let you know that the eyepiece is focused, and then you're seeing everything from the camcorder in proper focus the way it should be. Moving straight down from there, you can see that we've got an eyepiece release. And this allows us to slide the eyepiece off, and be very careful about doing this. And in fact, I recommend the only time you remove this eyepiece at all is if you need to clean out any gunk that might have gotten underneath there, some dust or maybe a hair or something. And just simply use a blower brush or something very gentle on this eyepiece. This is very fragile, and if you damage it, you've effectively ruined the way that you'll be looking through the eyepiece to see what's going into your camcorder. I recommend that you keep this on at all times, except for when you're closing things up and cleaning. So we'll slide that back on. And in fact, if you're shooting in really dusty or dirty areas, you might even consider putting a piece of saran wrap or a heavy rubber band or even a piece of gaffer's tape around the joint right here to keep dirt and grit from getting inside of the eyepiece. That way it's limited to getting inside the eye cup that we see here. Okay. Coming straight down from there, there's a headphone switch. Now this is something that's also kind of new in the Sony lineup. We don't see this on very many of their camcorders. The switch moves to the right, to the center, and then all the way to the left. When we move it all the way to the left, it gives us only channel 1. When we move it to the center, it gives us channel 1 and channel 2, so we're effectively hearing a stereo mix, or channel 1 in the left ear and channel 2 in the right ear. When we move it to channel 2, it allows us to only hear the right ear. So it allows us to manually monitor whatever we'd like to hear with this switch. And there's also some setups in the menus that relate to what we hear in the headphones. We'll get to that a little bit later on. Coming straight down from there, we've got a battery release, and by pressing on this and lifting up our battery, it releases the battery from the camcorder itself. Next, we get to the housing where our cards are stored. Now this camera is really unique this way. So let's go ahead and open that housing up, and you'll notice that there's 2 card slots under here. And in this camera, I've got a Memory Stick Pro Duo, and I've also got an SD card. So this camcorder is capable of using either SD cards or using Memory Stick Pro Duo cards. If you use SD, they need to be Class 6 or faster. We're using a Class 10 card here. These cards are pretty easy to find, but there's a number of different tools out there that we can use. The nice thing is we're not locked into just one card type. So it's great that Sony stepped up to the plate and given us the ability to use 2 different kinds of cards in this camcorder. You can mix and match them simultaneously. So if you've only got a couple of MSPD or Memory Stick Pro Duo cards, but you've got a bunch of SD cards lying around, great, go for it. Either one will work. You'll notice in here that there are 2 indicators. The indicator will show green for the active card that's being used. If you only have 1 card in there, of course you're only going to see 1 light indicator. It's important that while this light is red, while it's in a record mode or while it's writing something down to the card in write mode, you never move or remove the card. Don't do anything with it. So if you have a red indicator, don't touch that card. And I recommend that you keep this closed up so that we can keep it clean and moisture free inside of the housing here. File-based recording is really great, but like a tape camcorder, we need to take a little care to make sure that we don't get any dirt or moisture inside of there to keep our camcorder running the way that we want it to. Okay, coming over, we've got our battery housing. Next, we've got these 2 covers here. The first cover is what houses our composite video output. So this is going to output our SD video signal. So you'll notice that there's a yellow, white, and a red connector. These are RCA connectors. So we've got a composite signal and audio right and left coming out of underneath this cover here. Coming straight down from there, we've got 3 different connectors in here. We've got an HDMI output, HDMI, so that we can send this out to a high-definition monitor via HDMI. Now this is an uncompressed 10-bit output connection, but be aware that as with all HDMI channels, the last 2 bits are set to null or set to nothing, so it really only is an 8-bit uncompressed signal. You're not getting a full 10 bits out of here. You can use that HDMI output a couple of different ways. You can use it as a field monitor so that you're watching your video on a larger screen. You can also use it as a means of getting out to a mechanism such as one of those made by Blackmagic Design or Convergent Design Systems or AJA, where we would actually convert the uncompressed signal into a codec that our card is determining or our recording software is determining. So we can use this as an uncompressed 8-bit source video block without using the AVC HD compression that the camcorder offers. We can even record dual streams. You could record the computer in an uncompressed 8-bit HD signal while we're recording to AVC HD to the cards, and we can use the cards for our dailies if that's the way that you'd like to work. So you can record in a couple of different places here. Next to that, we've got a component out, or our RGB output. So we're able to output RGB, and then finally we've got a USB output here as well, and that allows the camcorder to act like a card deck. And this would be particularly important if you use the 120 gigabyte recording accessory available for the camcorder. So there's our three outputs there. Coming straight down, we've got something that's never been seen in a low-cost camcorder before. This is an SDI output. Now this is an HD SDI, SD SDI output. So we can use this to connect to a truck, or to an uncompressed capture system, or to a monitoring system that uses HD SDI or SDI. So we've got a number of different options available to us. Now again, keep that rubber cover in place when you're not using it so that it keeps that from getting any corrosion or moisture on that connector. Coming straight over to the right from there, you've noticed a release switch. Now, unless you've got the 120 gigabyte hard drive adapter system that goes on this camcorder, that's not going to be really good for you to use. But what this does is it allows us to release the block that puts the 120 gig recording system on the side of the camcorder. That gives you a tremendous amount of recording time if you've got that particular accessory. And then coming straight from there, we've got a GPS switch. This allows us to turn the GPS on or off. You see, the NXCAM records a GPS signal down onto the flash card when you're recording, if you want it to. And this might be data that's good for you to use a little bit later on, or pull up in Google Earth or some other device that can, or software that can read that GPS signal. If you want to save some battery life, or if you just don't need that GPS data, simply turn that off and it won't be recording the GPS data down to the card. So that gets us through everything on the rear of the camcorder. Let's move off to the right-hand side of the camcorder. Let's move to the right-hand side of the camcorder. On the right-hand side of the camcorder, we've got the 120 gig attachment point that we've already talked about. And then we're going to find on the base of the handle here, we'll see the power on-off button. By pressing the green button and rotating the switch upward, this turns the power to the camera on and allows us to use the thumb record button that's found there on the end of the handle. Okay, straight up from there, we've got a couple of different things. First of all, you'll notice that we've got a small rubber cover, and this covers up a link connection. This allows us to use link controllers with this particular camcorder. This is something that's kind of new. Sony got away from the link controllers on some of their other solid-state based camcorders, but it's back with this particular model. Moving straight up from there, we've got a button that can do two things, one of two things. There's an Assign 7 label that's put on that particular button, and expanded focus. That doesn't mean that it does an assignment and expanded focus. It just simply means that it's an assignable button and it's an expandable focus button. It can be either or, but it can't do both. Okay, so we'll assign this when we get into some of our memory settings. Straightforward from that, we have our rocker zoom control. Now the zoom control has normal speeds associated with it, but we can also change up the speeds of this mode in one of the menus, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. Okay. Coming straight forward of that on the right hand side, you'll find where we've got an RCA connector. Now what this RCA connector on the front of the camera handle is it allows us to use this camcorder as either a master or a slave in a multicam setup so that we can sync two cameras together. Now we'll dive into this a little bit more when we get into the menus. However, I want to tell you that this is not a Genlock type of connection. In other words, we don't have Genlock available on this kind of a camcorder, but we do have the ability to match up time codes so that we can lash two of these camcorders together and use them in a multicam editing setup a little bit later on. Let's come straight up from that, and that puts us right into the microphone block. There's some great things in the microphone block here. Let's go ahead and lift up the cover that covers over some of our switches. Now first of all, we've got a 3-position switch here. The first position is a line position, the second position is a mic position, and the third position is a mic position with phantom power. What that means is that with phantom power, we're going to send a 48-volt signal from the camcorder out to our microphone. If you're using a condenser type microphone, not a cardioid, I get an email about this once in a while. If you're using a condenser type of microphone, in other words, a microphone that needs external power, That means it's either got a battery built into it or it requires that it be powered from an external source. We're going to send 48 volts from this camcorder out to our microphone. So you don't necessarily need to use this 48 volt if you're using a dynamic type of mic instead of a condenser mic. It won't damage your microphone if you're using the phantom power and a dynamic mic, but it will run your battery down a little bit more quickly. So if you don't need a dynamic mic, in other words, if you don't need the phantom power, go ahead and shut it off and just leave this in mic mode. Where would you use the line mode? Easy. If you're connecting this camcorder up to a press box or maybe to a mixer with a low level output or a line level output on it, or maybe you're connecting into some kind of a broadcast system or a broadcast truck where we need to be able to feed a line system into the camcorder, this is where we're going to use and set the switch. We've got two of these switches, once for channel 1, once for channel 2, so that's why we see those there. Let's rotate around to the side. And we've got two XLR connectors with rubber covers. This simply allows us to plug in an XLR, in other words a low impedance microphone, directly into the camcorder. If you're not using the XLR inputs, make sure you leave them covered up. This prevents dirt or moisture or any foreign material from getting into that XLR connector and corroding it or getting it dirty and making it less reliable. Now you do have a microphone that came included with the camcorder. You don't need to use this if you don't want to, because the camcorder has got a second microphone system built into it. And that's also found right here in the front of the camcorder. It's a dual channel, in other words a stereo microphone that's built into the top front of the camcorder. You'll also notice that there's a tally light there on the front of the camcorder or on the front of that microphone that lets talent know that the camcorder is in record mode. We could turn that off when we get into some of the menu modes a little bit later on. Okay, so that gets us around the entire right hand side of the camcorder. Next, we're going to move up to the top. In the top of the camcorder, underneath the LCD panel, we find a number of different controls or different buttons and switches. The first one that we have is a visual index button, and what that does is it puts the camcorder into a playback mode so that we can see the last thing or see whatever's in our index of recorded files. That's all. It just gives us a quick access to whatever we recorded. So it's kind of like a last seen recorded button if you're coming from the world of tape. Next to that, we have transport controls that allow us to start, stop, rewind, pause, etc. Those files as we're looking at them. Next to that is a data code button. What this does is when we enable the data code, it allows us to see all of the settings that were used in the camera when that last scene was recorded. So if we're looking at a scene and we want to know where our lens or our iris setting was, what our picture profiles were if we had any, or any other data that's related to how that particular picture was shot, it's going to come up in the data code. If you don't want to see that information, just simply disable the data code display. Straight down from the data code button, we'll find a display button. What this allows us to do is provide a two-touch display, enable or disable or engage, disengage. So as we're looking at the screen, we can see a bunch of information on the screen here. And when we hit that display button, it turns off display items such as time code remaining, battery life remaining, and our audio. If we want to turn everything off, we are going to press that button twice. Pressing it once just simply turns off time code and battery and other information. Pressing it the second time turns off all data that's seen on our LCD panel. So if you want to have just a straight across view, we can have that straight across view. Now in the menu settings, you'll see where we can send all of this screen data out to an external monitor as well. And the data code switch here does control whether we do or don't see that on an external monitor. Straight down from there, we have a volume control. Now this volume control has nothing to do with the volume of audio or the level of audio being recorded into the camcorder down onto the flash system. What it does have to do with, or what it does relate to, is what we're hearing on our headphones when we're in the record mode, and when we're in playback mode, it controls the level of the speaker that's on the camcorder or what's coming out into the headphones. So it's just basically a monitoring volume control is what that's for. Coming off to the left-hand lower side, we have a menu button. Now that provides the same functionality as the menu button found on the side of the camera. So we can press the menu button and it calls up the menus. This means we can control the menus from the top of the camcorder or the side of the camcorder. Next to that, we've got a 4-button ring, and this allows us to navigate through that menu. So all we're going to do when we're in menu mode is press execute in that center portion of the ring, and that will allow us to get to the different functions that are found in the menu. Next to that, we have a modes switch, and this mode switch is exactly the same as the mode switch found on the side of the camcorder just like we saw earlier, when we press that mode switch, it opens up some of the touch screen commands so that we can navigate through the camcorder to necessary functions just a little bit more easily. For instance, if we want to set the camcorder up into slow, smooth record mode, or if we want to put it in HDSD mode, this is a quick way to get to those particular modes just by pressing the record mode button or the mode button. And next to that, we have a timecode U-bit button. And what this allows us to do is turn off timecode, or switch back and forth between timecode and U-bit display in our camcorder here. And so you can see how that works just by simply pressing that button. It switches that back and forth between timecode and U-bit information mode. Okay. Coming straight back from the control block on the top of the camcorder, we've got a record button with a lock, disengage, or engage switch. So if we want to turn off the record capability or the record button on the top of the camcorder, just simply slide the switch back to the hold position, and that disables the record button on the top of the camcorder. Or if you're in record mode, hit the record button and then slide that switch back into the hold mode, and that will disable the button from being disengaged or turned off. This camcorder is capable of recording for about 13 hours of uninterrupted recording time, depending on what memory system you've got attached to it. So if you're recording something that's long length, you're probably going to want to hit record and engage the hold button. Next to that, we have a zoom rocker switch. Now the zoom rocker switch has a couple of assignable modes. In the side of the camcorder handle here, you'll see that we've got a small switch. Putting it in the farthest forward position allows us a fairly fast zoom. Putting it in the middle position affords us a much slower zoom, and then putting it in the rear position, it disengages that rocker button entirely. So if you're holding the camcorder from the top a lot, you may want to disengage the zoom function with this small switch that's found on the side. Now you saw on the front of the camcorder we've got a cold shoe. On the rear of the camcorder we've got another cold shoe. And these two can work together depending on what you're doing. For example, on the front of my camcorder, I often like putting something like the Micro Pro from Light Panel on to light up my sources with my front end. And then here on the back side of the camcorder, it's nice to have a small HDMI monitor from someone like Marshall or one of the other HDMI monitor manufacturers that are out there. It gives us a little bit better insight as to what we're recording, and it's certainly a lot more accurate than the smaller panel that we've got on the camcorder itself. So this is just a cold shoe. Now underneath this cold shoe, you'll find that there is a post mount. This is great for times when you're going to be mounting this onto a dolly or a jib, or maybe you're just using a long boom pole and you're going to do a dog walk with this particular type of camcorder. So we've got a couple of different options, and we can just simply remove this cold shoe by lifting up on the metal tab, sliding this back, and then removing the 4 screws that are found on the top of the camcorder here. So it's pretty easy to set up. And that gets us through the entire top of our camcorder here. Let's dive into the menus next. Let's dive into these menu modes. Now again, it's a good idea to have your camcorder in your hand so that you can do some of these things right along with me. So in order to better see our menus, we're going to close down the lens hood here so that we're not looking at an image. That'll give us an idea of what's going on inside of our camcorder here. I'm also going to shut down the audio inputs on the camcorder so that we're not seeing any audio movement in the menu there. So let's first engage the menu button either on the top or the side of the camcorder. This brings us into this menu here. Now if you've just set your camcorder up for the first time, you're seeing the camera set indicator, and this is where we're going to set up the majority of our features inside the camcorder. So we'll either click the execute button or click in on the rotary button, and this takes us into our camera setup. The first thing that we have here is the gain setup. So we'll press execute or in on the wheel one more time, and this lets us go into our high, medium, and low switch settings that are found on the left-hand side of our camcorder. Now, here's where I've got some custom setups that are different than what comes out of the factory box. First of all, I like setting this camcorder up in a -3 gain setting in its lowest position. This doesn't do anything to the dynamic range of the camcorder. In other words, our whites are still as white as they're going to get, our blacks are still as black as they're going to get, but what it does do is it reduces the apparent amount or the ingested amount of electrical noise in our picture. So anytime you can go to a negative gain number, you're better off. So I set mine up for -3 dB, and so that's going to be the first setting that we're going to set up in our camcorder. So we'll scroll down to the bottom here, we'll set this up to -3 dB. And so we'll click that execute button, and you can see how we can dial that up or down to whatever our preferred setting is going to be. So -3. Next we'll go up to our medium setting. Now, everybody's got their own opinions of how they'd like this to work. I like to run mine in 3 dB increments, but you might want to have greater increments. So right now we've got a very large swing. We're going to go from minus 3 dB all the way up to plus 6 dB. That's a pretty big swing of 9 dB in gain change. The next setting you might have at 9 dB or maybe even 12 dB to give yourself another 6 dB worth of gain. So if you really need to pop that camera up, go ahead and set it up there. We can also set one more gain function we'll look at a little bit later on when we get into the button assignment switches. But for me, I don't like the camera inducing a lot of gain, and so I leave mine set to a fairly moderate 9 dB worth of gain. The camcorder can go all the way out to 12 dB worth of gain without putting in any objectionable noise, but the noise is there. If you're doing anything with compositing or you're going to be doing any masking or keying with this camcorder, I recommend that we never have any gain induced, because the noise, even though it's not apparent to the human eye, is very much there when we start dealing with the keyer. So just kind of bear that in mind when you're dealing with these different gain stages. All right, so let's get out of our gain controls. Click back up to OK. Hit the switch. The next thing that's in here is smooth gain. Now we've got 3 different options, or actually 4 different options here. We have an off, fast, a middle setting, and then a slow setting. What this does is it controls the amount of knee or the ramp as the camcorder is going from one gain setting to the next gain setting. It can either be a very fast change, and it will be quite abrupt, and that's in the off mode, or we can set it up so that it's got a high ramp, a very fast ramp, or a medium ramp where it's not quite as quick. Sometimes this is called a knee, or we can have a very slow ramp as it goes through the different gain stages here. This is where you'll have to set it up for the way that you best want to work. If you're going from really bright settings out to really dark settings so that we're going to be seeing a lot of change in gain, you might want to set this up to be fairly abrupt so that it's apparent as you go from one place to the next. But if they're minor changes or if they're slow changes, set this up to work the way that you want it to work. Take this back up, and I'm going to leave this set to the middle setting. Next, we'll get down to hypergain. Now, hypergain is something that I leave turned off. This is a manual setting where we can turn it on or off inside the camcorder, but we can assign hypergain to a button. So as we get into the assign button modes, we can assign this hypergain setting to a button. Hypergain gives us a tremendous amount of gain. It'll take the camera up to its loudest or its noisiest position, but it'll see things that the human eye almost can't see. It'll really give us a much better picture when we're in those super dark areas and we absolutely have to record. So you can have some fun with the hypergain modes if that's something that you like. It's also, by a side note, it's a creative choice. And you can use hypergain to create certain kinds of looks that are very difficult to do in post naturally. So we're going to leave this set to off. Next, we're going to come down to our AGC limit, our automatic gain control limit. So we can set the camcorder up so that when it's in auto modes, it will automatically control, or it will control the amount of gain that it can apply. And I leave mine set to 12 dB because that's about the maximum that I want this camcorder to go on its own without me giving it permission to go a little bit farther. So if I'm in auto mode, this is where it's going to lock itself down so that it can't go any farther than 12 dB worth of gain. If we need to change that, just simply hit the execute button or the menu button, and we can crank that all the way up to 18 dB, or we can just leave it set to off and set it up so that it has its maximum level there. Then we have minus AGC, and we've already enabled this, so we're going to leave this turned on. In other words, so we can go down to that negative control. Again, using a negative control doesn't affect our dynamic range in any way. It just simply means that we can reduce the amount of apparent electrical noise in the camcorder. As far as I'm concerned, this really should be a default mode. Okay, let's come down to our iris ring rotate. Now, the iris ring on this camcorder is set up to operate like any broadcast lens. In other words, as we turn the lens to the right, it closes down the iris, and as we turn it to the left, it opens the iris up. So let's get into our modes here. We'll rotate that iris ring, and you can see as I rotate that to the right, it closes down our iris. As I rotate it to the left, it opens our iris up. Now what we can do is in our menu mode, we can go through and we can reverse that or turn it to the opposite direction. The time where you might want to do this is if you're using this camera like a doggy cam and you've got it down really low, or maybe you've got it up high and you need to be able to close it down. You can reverse that ring for those types of situations. But for the most part, you're probably going to leave it in the default setting. Or maybe you've just got a personal preference that you'd like it to go the other way. Okay, next, our white balance preset. Remember earlier I said that we can have some preset white balance modes in the camcorder on this button that's on the side, or if we're into an auto mode. Okay, if we're going to use the white balance preset that's found in the bottom position of that three-way handle, we can set that up for indoor or outdoor depending on the type of shooting that we're dealing with. Right now we've got it set for indoor because we are indoors. Now again, I like using a manual white balance. Sometimes I'll white balance to a warm card, or I'll white balance to a color other than white, just to give the camera a particular look and change the Kelvin temperature. That can be a really cool creative choice, but you know, your needs may vary from what I'm doing. So this is a place where we can set that indoor white balance preset, or the outdoor white balance preset. Next, we've got a white balance indoor level. So we can swing the white balance outdoor level up or down to swing the color temperature a little bit different in either direction. Just a really great way that we can work. Now I recommend that if you do this, that you not use the LCD panel or the EVF to determine how far you want to swing that white balance. I really recommend that you use an outdoor monitoring system or an external monitoring system on the camcorder. Marshall makes a really fantastic battery powered system. If you need something that's small and lightweight, you can plug in via HDMI. Let's back out of here. Next, we can get to our white balance temperature set. So we can manually set our white balance temperature right here if that's what you'd like to do. Okay, we get back out of there and get back into our menu modes. Next, we have our auto white balance sensitivity modes, and we can set it up so that it's intelligent, so that it just simply does it as best it can, or we can set it up for different ramps. So let's click into here. We're going to have a high-speed auto white balance sensitivity, middle, or low. So in other words, we can make it as sensitive as we would like. I leave mine set to the intelligent mode, but again, I don't use the auto modes in the camcorder very often, so your mileage may vary. If you're not someone who likes to use manual white balance, or maybe you just simply want to let the camera handle things for you, I recommend leaving this mode in the intelligent mode. And again, I'm not a big fan of using the auto anything on the camcorder. You get generally a better picture in manual mode, so I don't use this feature. Your mileage may vary. Smooth white balance. Now, as the camcorder goes through these automatic settings, there again are ramps, just like the gain control, as to how fast it will bloom from one or move from one white balance setting to another. We can have it bloom where it's a really big or noticeable difference, or we can have it be a very gradual change. The camcorder can work with that. I leave mine set to the middle mode because, again, if I am going to go to that fully auto mode, I want the camcorder to limit how far it's going to change things as it's going from one scene to another. You'll have to decide what works best for you depending on the types of shooting environments that you're in. So we're going to leave this set to middle. In our auto exposure shift, we can swing the auto exposure up or down. Now, I tend to find that all of these camcorders, when they're in different types of auto modes, tend to overexpose a little bit. It's not something I like very much at all, and so I tend to set this up so that if I am using an auto mode in a fast situation, I want the camera to underexpose by just a little bit. Again, your mileage may vary. I've got mine set up to -3 here, but you can swing this as much as you'd like to. It doesn't matter which of these camcorders I'm working with. I always set up to at least a -1 and sometimes a little bit more. So we'll get out of this mode, go back up to OK. And our auto exposure response. How quickly do we want it to change its exposure levels? Do we want it to change fast or slow? This is a mode where I like it to be fairly fast as it goes from one shot to the next in the different exposure modes. Your mileage may vary, and you'll want to experiment with this one just a little bit. Next up is our auto iris limit. Now, when we're in automatic modes, we can lock down the camcorder so that it can't go too far open or too far closed in the iris. Because this is a 1/3 inch chip camcorder, it really has its sweet spot somewhere in the f4 to f8 range. And so I really don't want this camcorder opening up any more than the f4 if it's going to be automated. And I don't want it to close down any farther than f8. So I'm going to set it up so that it can't go any tighter than f8. And that allows me to work with it a little bit easier in these different modes. That might mean, just be aware that if you set this up so that it can only open up so far, or rather close down so far, that might mean that it's going to be inducing gain. So just be aware that these two things will work together. So I've got mine set up at f8, and your mileage may vary as to what you want, but here's how we're going to shift that back and forth. Okay. I'm going to leave that set there. Next is our flicker reduce. Flicker reduce is a really great feature to have when we're dealing with situations where we've got fluorescent lighting. And so if we're in an environment where we've got fluorescent lighting, or maybe we've got different types of lighting sources that are mixed, it's a good idea to turn on this flicker reduce. It just might save your tail, because that's not something that you can deal with in post. So flicker reduce is a great feature for when you're shooting those kinds of environments. Next, we have a spotlight and a backlight mode. In the backlight and spotlight modes, these are not accessible when the camera is in a fully automatic function. So if we put the camcorder in fully manual modes, we can't access these. So we need to be in an auto function when we're going to access them. So where would we use these two modes? Well, backlight is when you've got someone or a subject that you're shooting that has got the sun or another bright light source that's behind it. And this will attempt to bring the exposure level up. Keep in mind that as it's doing so, it's also going to raise the backlight. So it may well be that you've got a blown out background, but your subject is properly exposed. Spotlight's just the opposite. You've got something that's really blasted with a spotlight. Maybe you're shooting at a gymnasium or a church or at a sporting event where spotlights are being used on the stage or on the field. Well, this is a way that you can raise up the outside information and bring down or try and balance what's in the spotlight versus what's surrounding that object or that subject. Okay, so spotlight and backlight